the age of 90. We've heard eulogies celebrating his memory as an icon of the 20th century and obituaries setting down a litany of human rights abuses. At one end of the spectrum, the Irish president, Michael D. Higgins, said Fidel Castro will be remembered as a giant among global leaders whose view was not only one of freedom for his people, but for all the oppressed and excluded peoples on the planet. At the other end, the US President-elect Donald Trump said, "Today the world marks the passing of a brutal dictator who opposed his own people for nearly 6 decades." Sinn Féin's President Gerry Adams recalled Fidel Castro as a leader who was very conversant with Irish history and a good friend to the Irish people and an admirer of our struggle, especially the hunger strikers of 1981, while Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn described him as a huge figure of modern history, national independence and 20th century socialism. How do you remember the former Cuban leader? A brave liberator or a brutal dictator? Phil Kelly is from the Northern Ireland Labour Party Executive Committee. Douglas Murray is from The Spectator. Welcome to both of you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How do you remember him, Phil?
Well, let me first start in a testament to how divisive an issue this is seen as, that I'm speaking entirely in a personal capacity today, William.
Labour Party's divided.
Indeed. Some things are constant. What I would be reminded of is the words of Ernesto Guevara, the final words that he said in the face of his executioner. His last words were, "Shoot coward, you only kill a man." And what he meant was that the values and the principles of the revolution that he espoused didn't die with his death. And it fits neatly to Fidel Castro, because I think we are right to mourn a champion of liberating the struggle against oppression, against imperialism. However, what cannot be placed in a grave, what cannot be fenced off by the blockade, is the principles and the achievements of the Cuban Revolution. And they are seen not only in Cuba, in the healthcare system and the education system, free to all, but from the barrios of Venezuela and Colombia, where Cuban doctors serve for free, to the Ebola clinics of Africa, where Cuban doctors were the largest responders to that crisis, or even in the immediate wake of Hurricane Matthew, which devastated Cuba, but Cuba was well prepared. The first responder to their neighbour Haiti, who were left devastated, was the Cuban government and the Cuban people. Now, in 1991, we were told, or even before that, that the sanctions would bring down the end of Castro's Cuba. They didn't. In 1991, with the fall of the USSR, we were told that Castro's Cuba would soon follow. With the then subsequent difficult economic period, we were told Castro would go. It didn't happen. Then when Castro left power, we were told very soon things would change. They didn't. And now in his death, I think that the Cuban people will continue to confound their critics and show that the revolution in Cuba is more than one man. It is espoused by a people and by a nation who are proud and who have dignity, and that's thanks to the revolution that was led by Fidel Castro.
Douglas Murray, how do you see him? How do you think history should judge Fidel Castro?
Well, it'll see him as a minor 20th century dictator and will undoubtedly regard his main contribution to history as being the one which is the reason why so many people are celebrating him now, and why they celebrate him throughout his life, which was that he became a figurehead for anti-Americanism globally. He became a lightning rod for everybody who admired anyone who stood up to the American superpower. And it was his fate and his luck, indeed, that he was lucky in his choice of enemy and in the missteps of his enemy. Had it not been for the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion and the opportunity before and particularly after that to present himself as this anti-American figurehead, he would have been a very minor figure. As it was, I'm very skeptical, as I think people should be, about the eulogies to him for two reasons primarily. The first is the fact that he was in the mold of most of the dictators of his time, a grotesque abuser of human rights, a murderer of his enemies, a torturer of his opponents. He claimed to be the voice of the voiceless whilst killing those who disagreed. And the second reason why, of course, we should be very skeptical of the eulogies is simply because his contribution to history, such that is, is this claim that he sort of spearheaded a revolutionary socialist and indeed a communist agenda. In actual fact, as often happened in that period, there was a specific native local reason for the revolution. And after the fact, it got this sort of intellectual coating painted over it. A lot of other revolutions and movements at the same time did the same thing. You know, take North Korea. Kim Il-sung was very close to Fidel Castro. The North Korean revolution, the same way the North Korean independence movement was not a communist movement, but it managed to sort of coat itself in this. It managed to get a veneer of intellectual justification, and as with Castro, found apologists around the world from people who claimed to be admiring its revolutionary socialism and so on. And really, it was just about the fact that it appeared, I think erroneously, but it appeared to present really an opposition to America and the American view of the world.
Well, Castro is polarizing and divisive. We're all agreed on that in terms of how people read history, and that's true also of the comments that are coming into Talkback today. Paul says Castro will go down as a great warrior for social justice. Liam says it's ironic that the opener is a quote from a victim of a firing squad. Castro presided over some 4,000 firing squads targeting his political opponents. Phil Kelly, why didn't he trust ordinary Cubans with free elections?
Well, he does. I mean,
there's only one party.
That's a misunderstanding of the Cuban system. And also what we've heard over the last day or two is the term democracy thrown around as if it's an established thing, as if it's not a contestable term. There are elections in Cuba. Local delegates are elected, and they have a system of government which they see as democratic and open.
All right, so now, only one political party is allowed to...
I'm sorry.
Only one political... Listen, only one political party is allowed to stand candidates in the elections.
Non-party delegates stand at local level.
Is that a description of free elections?
It's what we witnessed in America, the description of free elections, where the popular vote is won by one right-wing candidate, only to be beaten by the electoral college system by another
They have an
right-wing
electoral
candidate.
college system.
Yeah.
But people have a free vote, don't they?
Yeah, but you see that as a democracy. We have two parties in America that represent the totality of America.
I see that as a diversion from the question I'm asking you. Why can't people in Cuba who disagree with the Castro brothers regime, why can't they stand for election and allow the Cuban people to decide whether or not to vote for them?
Well, let me explain. What I would say is from left and right, we talk about this divisive issue, that on the left, we should look and be critical of the mistakes and the wrongs that the Cuban regime done. But from the right, people like Douglas should look at the successes of the Cuban Revolution and be self-critical and say, what can we learn from this too?
We should just look away from the lack of free elections.
Regarding democracy and repression within Cuba, let's put it in the context that this is a country that has survived a 50-year blockade by the biggest superpower in global history. It is a country that faced an invasion by the biggest superpower in history. It is a country where the leader has had to survive over 600 assassination attempts. Now, if that is a champion of free world democracy, the actions of the United States of America, then I don't know what you would damn as an imperialist superpower wielding undemocratic interference into other sovereign nations. And if we look at what they did throughout Latin America and continue to do, which we've seen in Honduras and Brazil, they have undermined democracy throughout that continent. And in order for the Cuban Revolution to survive, certain measures were taken, certain vigilance was put in place, which I find difficult, but I can understand why.
We're asking for your call, 03030 80 55 55. Join the debate. We're talking to Phil Kelly from the Northern Ireland Labour Executive Committee. He says he's speaking in a personal capacity. Douglas Murray from The Spectator is also with us. And we're asking you this simple question. How do you think history should judge Fidel Castro? Is his legacy more akin to a Pinochet or to a Mandela? Tell us what you think. Let's go first to Eric. Hello, Eric.
Hello, William. William, I'm not an authority on Cuba, but I do recall visiting Cuba about 14 years ago. And before that, I had heard about this Fidel Castro with forces advancing towards Havana. And they took over Cuba. And now, when I was in Cuba 14 years ago, the people I met were all pro-Castro, of course. Were invited to schools, to seeing the children being educated, and we're told or invited to hospitals and told all about the health care in Cuba. And generally, the ones all I heard, they were very much pro-Castro and said that conditions had improved considerably since the anti-Castro regime that was in existence beforehand. So it's an interesting meeting and hearing these various people. And the impression I got was that the majority of people seemed to welcome and were pro-Castro regime.
Well, 1 million people had already exiled themselves somewhere else, hadn't they? They'd left the country because of the abuses they say they faced in Cuba.
Castro was advancing towards Havana. Yes, many of them fled across to United States. And when Castro took over power, that many of these ones who fled it returned in an invasion sponsored by United States to invasion of Cuba to overturn Castro. But of course, the Castro forces defeated that. And that was the end of that.
All right, Eric, thank you very much. Here's Mary. Hello, Mary. Welcome to Talkback, Mary.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I also believe, and I feel in my heart and soul, that the world is being misguided. We have people voting for socialism, and true socialism is not about blowing people to smithereens, killing people for jobs and power. You know, true socialism doesn't go out to hurt or harm. They go out to make things better for humanity. And what's running the country, this country and other countries, people are voting, I don't know where their heads are, but they're voting for the most extreme. And when these people get in power, they bring their families on, they bring all their relations and their friends on, and there's no jobs really left for the ordinary working class person in the street.
How do you see the legacy of Fidel Castro, Mary?
I think he's a very evil man who's totally corrupted, and he's abused his power to get where he wanted for himself alone and his family and his friends and his body. And I think a lot of people have suffered terribly, and they may use the free education. They don't have books. They may give them free hospitalising. They don't give people tablets or phones. They control, they dictate, and what they do, they censorship people, and that's a very dangerous path that the people are going along now by voting in these true socialists who destroy lives, kill innocent people to get what they want, power and control over the most vulnerable.
Mary, thank you very much. I'll just put this to Phil Kelly. I'm reading from the Amnesty International report into Cuba. On this point about censorship, the government continues to limit access to the internet as a key way of controlling both access to information and freedom of expression. Only 25% of the Cuban population is able to get online. Only 5% of homes have internet access. And over more than 5 decades documenting the state of human rights in Cuba, Amnesty International records a relentless campaign, I'm quoting again, a relentless campaign against those who dare to speak out against the Cuban government's policies and practices, with many hundreds of stories of prisoners of conscience, people detained by the government solely for peacefully exercising their right to freedom of expression, assembly and association, including journalists. Now, you're a Democrat, you're a socialist. Can you support that kind of regime?
I can support the Cuban regime, and I would. And there's aspects of the Cuban regime I find uncomfortable, and I think that need to change. But I understand it in a historical context of standing up to an imperial power, which is forcing a horrendous economic embargo on you, that these kind of open discussions are difficult and mute. What I would say there, you said about access to internet. The Cuban government is currently trying to negotiate access to an underwater cable so as it can provide cheap and open access to the internet to all Cubans. It is the American government that is forestalling that. If you want to talk about human rights abuses in Cuba as well, I'd like to remind your listeners that there are atrocities being committed in Cuba. There are torture. They happen to be in a place which is still run and occupied illegally by the American government, a naval base called Guantanamo Bay. Now, for the United States of America, as the leader of the free world, to lecture Cuba on human rights, the United States of America, which will not sign up to International Criminal Court,
the United States of America, it's Amnesty International.
Is ridiculous. No, but what I'm saying, yeah, and Cuba does not rate highly on Amnesty International's list of countries. In fact, there's quite a few countries above it who we deal with. Ones like Saudi Arabia that we arm to the teeth, where homosexual men can be executed. And yet our Queen flies her flag at half-mast when King Abdullah dies. So let's get some perspective. I don't see Saudi Arabia or those kind of countries that we're happy to do deals with sending doctors and medicine throughout the world.
Douglas Murray, would you accept that American-style liberal democracy is not the only kind of democracy in the world? And for many of the people who live in Cuba, it's more important to them that they get food on the table, that they get free healthcare, that they get an education, that they feel safe, rather than that they get the same kind of freedoms in democratic terms that people in Florida might get.
I'm so amazed listening to my fellow guests here, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are as well. It's just not necessary, Phil, to keep covering for this. I mean, you can just say it was just awful what he did, and there is no excuse for it. And instead, this endless stream of justifications and what ifs, and, well, what about these people, and finger pointing and look the other way. You know, it should be perfectly possible to say Fidel Castro was many things, and one of them was a brutal and vile thug and dictator.
Why do you not say that about successive American presidents who operated in Guantanamo Bay?
First of all, let's just remember the Guantanamo Bay is a totally separate issue. It's a prison camp detaining people caught in conflict, combatants on the battlefield. And by the way, the current American president is trying to make sure that the last people who remain in Guantanamo Bay, and there aren't very many, are released by the end of his presidency. But
do you believe that Barack Obama has authorized as many killings as Fidel Castro has done?
Can I just finish this point? You see, this is what the weird socialist, revolutionary wannabe brigades always do. It's always about America. And, just get back to the point. You've just had your other guest there trying to explain how something could be a democracy without election.
Douglas, hang
on, let me finish. How a system in which Fidel Castro understandably regarded, as others did, the Batista regime as being anti-democratic, then himself comes into power and never has another election. So we don't need to have all of this justification and the finger pointing at America to simply recognize what any decent person should be able to recognize. You can admire something about Fidel Castro's politics. I happen not to particularly. But why, if you admire an element of his politics, do you have to cover over for the fact that he was a thug and a dictator and an extremist and the sort of person you shouldn't be covering for?
Right, you talk about covering, and you talk about, he's a figurehead for this kind of loony left. Let me remind you that the first person, when he was released from prison, that Nelson Mandela thanked for bringing an end to apartheid was Fidel Castro and the commitment of 36,000 troops to fight in Angola, which brought apartheid to its knees. Also, let me remind you as well, when we talk about America or anti-Americanism, Castro is revered in America.
But Mandela introduced free elections. He introduced a constitutional court.
Can I finish? Can I have the same respect?
Go right ahead.
Because we talk about America and anti-Americanism. Let me tell you this: Fidel Castro in Cuba is revered within huge sections of the American population. He stayed in Harlem when he visited America. He's revered there. In fact, there is still young female and male students that travel from Harlem and get free university education in Havana. And also the Reverend Jesse Jackson today was raising the point that he has championed the defense of rights of black people across the globe. And if you look at America, where a black male is more likely to go to prison than go to a university, and compare that to the freedom in Cuba, where you're more likely to go to free university, free healthcare.
Douglas Murray, then I'll come back to the phone lines. Go ahead, Douglas.
This is just the same thing again, you see. This is what Phil's interested in. He's not particularly able to defend Castro. Nobody really is. No serious person really can defend this brute and sadist. But what it really is about is hating America. Now, look, America has all sorts of things wrong with it. It, of course, unlike Fidel Castro, has elections. It has leaders who replace other leaders. They correct the mistakes, and sometimes they'll make new ones. But that's the thing with democracy and most of us regard democracy as being quite a good thing still. But, this is it. It's about Fidel Castro's allegedly brilliant, brave standing up to America. And you see, actually, we don't, this veneer that people really admire Castro, they admire him for hating America and standing up for America. And the people who dislike America use Fidel Castro as their sort of admiration figure for that reason. But just consider the following. Barack Obama managed to try to normalize relations with Cuba 2 years ago. And it's probably the case that now that Fidel Castro is dead, that the Cuban people and the American government will be able to normalize relations to some extent. Why were they not able to be normalized for all those years? Actually, throughout successive American presidents, Jimmy Carter, right through to Barack Obama and before, there could have been a normalization of relations at any point if it hadn't have been for the fact that this belligerent man who was set up as this icon, who has this alternative history written about him, was such a lightning rod, such a figurehead, that he couldn't bend and didn't want to. And as a result, the Cuban people remained in misery for years.
Well,
and
the CIA did try to kill him more than 600 times.
I'd remind you of one other thing, if I may. The reason why in Miami the other night, when the news of Fidel Castro's death came, the reason why the Cuban exiles were cheering in the streets and beeping their horns is because they understood the fact that this man had not raised up Cuba, he had immiserated it. And it is the greatest shame imaginable that when he did that to the Cuban people, people around the world who claimed themselves to be on the international left and on the side of the people, used that situation and helped to perpetuate that situation for their own anti-American ideological reasons. It's the greatest shame in the world.
All right, I'm going to go to the phone lines. We're talking to Phil Kelly and Douglas Murray. There's a revolution on the phone lines. We'll try and get as many as we can onto the programme today. 03030 80 55 55. Brian, you're first. Good afternoon, sir.
Hi, William. I was just thinking that if I had the option of being poor in the United States and being poor in Cuba, or as far as I can see, you've got a job, you've got a house, you've got free education, you've got free healthcare, I know which one I'd pick. Because as far as I can see, with the recent US election, I mean, democracy is frankly a sham. And really, in the end of the day, it comes down to, your own personal circumstances of having healthcare, job, etc.
It wouldn't matter to you, Brian, that you weren't able to vote for someone other than the single party that runs the country.
Well, that's the point I'm making. I mean, if my choice is vote for Donald or Hillary and live in poverty with no access to decent healthcare, education, or anything else, which a large population of the United States has, in Cuba, where these things aren't guaranteed, I know which one I would choose, and a lot of people would choose.
Tell me this, if Cuba is so proud of the social and economic improvements that have accompanied this regime and of their healthcare system, why have they consistently refused to allow the Red Cross in to have a look at just how good it is?
I'm not sure. I mean, I do agree with your other contributors that Castro was too strict. I mean, for example, the travel ban, I think it should be opened up because you will find a lot of people will leave, but a lot of people will come back and go back and forward. Because, I mean, what we're discovering in our society is, I mean, we're one of the richest societies in the world, but was it 20%, 30% of our population are taking antidepressants? So we're discovering that this kind of like neoliberal capitalist system we have isn't perfect either. I mean, I'm sure that I would guarantee that the people in Havana and those poorest areas are happier than the people we have in our housing estates that are like Belfast.
Great call. Thank you very much, Brian. Much appreciated. We'll go to Alex. Hello, Alex.
Yeah, good morning. No, it's just the original question was how will Castro be remembered? And I think it's quite clear from what we've listened to that those that admire him will continue to admire him, and those that condemn him as a demagogue and a dictator will continue to do so. What I did find interesting was when listening to the Northern Ireland Labour Party representative, he talked about how the Cubans, to maintain the revolution, were forced to make difficult decisions. In other words, they were forced to suspend, not to have democracy, to have a one-party state. It's the same in Zimbabwe. I'd wonder if the Labour Party ever got power in the UK and their changes hadn't quite worked and they faced electoral defeat, would he justify the same thing over here? Would he justify suspension of elections so that
it wouldn't be the first time, Alex. It wouldn't be the first time historically that the basic principles of democracy were suspended by a country. because it was in an emergency situation. Abraham Lincoln did it during the American Civil War. De Gaulle did it in France during the Algerian crisis. Some people make the argument, don't they, that in order to protect democracy at times under emergency circumstances, you have to act in undemocratic ways.
I think not to have an election during a war is one thing. Not to have an election because your social experiment hasn't actually got the support of the people, which would seem to be the case in Cuba. Because, I mean, after all, if Castro could have went to the people with a proper open democracy and won an election every time, presumably he would have done so. That's the situation I'm talking about. Not a situation where we're in the Third World War. We're in a situation where a party has taken power, has introduced social changes, and those changes haven't worked.
All right,
and they
Alex.
have to the election because
Alex, thank you very much.
Castro,
of course, would say he was involved in a war. It was an imperial war. It was a Cold War period, and they were emergency circumstances. David, how are you doing? Good afternoon,
Hello,
sir.
William. Exactly the point I was going to make. One of them, I suppose. We're not going to go through the history about the Batista regime and what existed before Fidel Castro took power.
Let's just say 20,000 or so people murdered by the Batista regime.
But the point was that they were murdered because American money was used in that country to turn it into a virtual bordello for all the lowlights.
And I think that's well accepted, isn't it? That it was a mafia playground.
Yes, most people understand it, I presume. But the point we have to remember, and the point you've just made, William, is that there was a war. Since Castro took over, America was at war with Cuba. In the same way as Britain suspended elections during the war here, there was no possibility of having elections there. They would have been completely wrecked by the Americans anyway. I mean, we know that America actually were thinking of dropping an atomic bomb on Cuba. Some of the more nutcasey generals were trying to convince Kennedy to do that. We know about the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
And we also know that Castro wrote to Khrushchev and recommended that he drop an atomic bomb as a preemptive strike on the United States.
That could be apocryphal. We don't know that. I've read that too, but I mean, that would be a perfect thing for somebody to say who hated Castro.
Not sure that is apocryphal. We have the letter.
The thing is, to my mind, Castro. First of all, there's a couple of other points. Your friend talked a while about why he didn't suggest normalization during that procedure, during that period with the states. This is when the states were trying to kill him. They tried to kill him, I don't know, 20, 30
No, more than 600 times, I think.
Exploding cigars, all this nonsense. And all
Operation
those
Mongoose.
Characters you saw in Florida, who he says they know the regime. They don't know the regime. Very few of them are first-generation Cubans. Their descendants were the people who were ejected from Cuba because they collaborated with Batista. They were the people that collaborated, and they got out. They fled for their lives.
Could I?
They hit.
Could I correct?
Let me just bring Douglas in on that point. Go ahead, Douglas.
Just point that isn't the case at all. People have been continuing to flee Cuba all the time in the years since the revolution. In fact, since 2014, when Barack Obama tried to normalize relations a bit more with Cuba, the number of people fleeing the island has gone up. So you see, if it were this socialist paradise that the international anti-American left wished it to be,
you're the only one.
It wouldn't explain why so many people have continued to try to leave. They try to leave because they want a normal life. They want normal living standards. They want to live in a normal society, which has an election more than once a century. And can I just come back to this point? You just to make one other correction, by the way, the fact that Fidel Castro lobbied Nikita Khrushchev to do a first strike nuclear attack on the United States is not apocryphal. And that's very, very important to state, because you see...
We have the letter. The letter is in the public domain.
Exactly. And you see, this comes back to a crucial thing. You see, I just think this is a very embarrassing situation for somebody to be in, like Phil at this point. You see, it should not be so hard for somebody to say, Fidel Castro shouldn't have tried to urge a first strike nuclear attack on the United States of America. He shouldn't have slaughtered and by firing squad and torture his political opponents. He should have had elections. He should have been able to raise living standards in Cuba and not keep the Cuban people immiserated. It shouldn't be so hard to say all of these things and to still be a, vague socialist, leftist, whatever you want to be. It's just an embarrassing situation for grown-up to be in.
Well,
that you can't
okay, Douglas, Pause for a
Fidel
second. Phil
Castro was
Kelly's
a
clearly
terrible
not
man.
embarrassed to be making the arguments today. Let's get your response.
Absolutely, I'm not, and I'm proud to. And it shouldn't be difficult to get your voice out in this show, Douglas.
You've had a lot more say than Douglas Murray's had so far.
Well, what I would say is this. We're coming up to Christmas, and one of my favourite films is It's a Wonderful Life, in which the lead character gets to see what the world would be like if he never existed. Well, in Cuba's respect, we have that example because there's the capitalist-backed Haiti regime right beside them, and it has depths of poverty and despair unimaginable to people living here. And if you contrast that to what exists in Cuba, then you see a real difference. Also, I'd like to say this. People are talking about normalization, democracy, etc., without understanding the historical context. When Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, he tried to go down that route. And how did that end? It ended in a burning presidential palace, in a CIA-backed coup, and a fascist military dictatorship imposed upon that country, where thousands of people with the backing of the United States were disappeared and tortured. So to get lectures about the free world from yourself is deplorable.
Here's an interesting one.
Make this quick. I want to go back to the phones. Lots and lots of people want to join the debate.
It's very interesting, you see, because I believe in free market economics and democracy. But I wouldn't find myself in the situation of saying that Pinochet was a wonderful man who raised literacy standards in Chile. And you see, you are stuck in that position. You're stuck in it for a bizarre ideological reason. And as I say, why don't you try to step out of it?
Well, because
Fidel Castro was many things, and one of them was a thug and a dictator.
All right, I'll come back to you in a second, Phil. Let's go to the phones again. John's there. Hello, John.
Hello, William. I don't recognise the version or the definition of Castro that Douglas is talking about. I've been to Cuba. Cuba's not a socialist paradise, but neither is it some kind of gulag of Russian proportions that he seems to suggest. I think that you have to compare Cuba not to France or Britain or Germany or somewhere, or even America. You compare, if you want to compare it to the other countries that surround it in South and Central America, you can walk the streets of Cuba, you can feel comfortable there, and you don't feel that you're going to be murdered by a death squad. And what defines Cuba today is not what happened in the 1960s. What defines Cuba today is the blockade, the
economic sanctions.
Yes, and the reason people leave, and this is a factual statement. This isn't some kind of lefty kind of conspiracy. Why people leave today is because their economic situation is bad, and Cuban officials admitted to me that they're not doing enough for their people. But
people in Cuba live on rations. You're allowed a bar of soap a month. People live on rations, and there's a big black economy around all of that. But you're saying the responsibility for that rationing system is the United States and the economic embargo rather than Castro's policies.
Absolutely. I mean, there was no doubt about it up until when Russia was backing the Cuba. There was a lot to be. You can make that argument, but for the last 20 odd years or more, Cuba has been trying to run itself in some kind of economic independence. But
why don't they allow a free press? Why are they locking up journalists? Why are people still being disappeared in Cuba today?
But what I'm saying is that if we compare that to what happens in Europe and stuff, that's deplorable, and it's deplorable anywhere. Human rights are the same everywhere. But if you walk down the streets of Guatemala or Haiti or some of these other places, it is in relative terms, and he's not a saint, Fidel, nor is he some kind of devil. And if you go, what politician will go to his grave and think, what have I done? Many people's lives have I saved in my own country by having a health system which is health standards that even the West can't compete with, that have provided education.
Well, again, you say that, but I'll make this point again. Wow. I'll make this point again, John. The Red Cross is denied access to examine the health system and to find out just how good it actually is.
Well, hold on a minute. I don't know if that's a detail, but there's empirical evidence which shows that the health system in Cuba is.
Could I?
That's a fact, and Douglas can go off on some kind of ideological rant about.
Could I ask you
all right, John.
And it's not the case. It's just factually not true.
Can I ask you a question?
Cuban health service is
John, take a question from Douglas. I got to move on, but take a quick question.
Can I ask you, God forbid, that let's say you were diagnosed with cancer today, would you rather go to the Mayo Clinic in Florida, or would you go to Cuba for your cancer treatment?
Well, if I was very wealthy, I would be able to go to the Mayo Clinic. But if I was poor, I wouldn't be able to. And I've lived in America, and I've seen people in America who've had to save up for years to have even people with insurance.
Okay, let's try it again. If you want to dodge it that way, would you rather go to
I
the
didn't
NHS?
dodge. I answered. You just didn't like the answer.
Go to the NHS? Okay, let's do it another way. Would you rather have your cancer treatment on the NHS or in Cuba? Because you said it was better than any Western health system. Would you rather have your cancer treatment on the NHS?
You've got to give us your answer in 30 seconds. I'm afraid, John. We're really out of time on it.
You may be correct in cancer, but you're completely wrong in primary health care and every other type of health care. On the very severe health system stuff, Cuba isn't as good as the West, but for many of other more ordinary illnesses and many illnesses don't require intensive
John, thank you very much. I'm really sorry to rush you. So many people wanted to join this conversation. We've got time for 2 more calls. We're talking to Douglas Murray and Phil Kelly. Let's go to Louis. Hello, Louis.
How you doing? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Louis. Go right ahead.
Right. What I'd like to talk about is I'd like to go back to 1963. And at that time, the Royal Navy used to patrol the Caribbean, and I was on a ship there. It was called, funny enough, HMS Londonderry, believe it or not. And what we used to do every couple of weeks, we used to go down to this little uninhabited island, which was about 15, 20 miles from Cuba, and pick up Cuban refugees, and then we'd bring them up to Miami and drop them off to the American Coast Guards. And it's very similar to what's happening today. When you look at the Mediterranean, and we used to pick up all these refugees. Mostly at that time, they were quite professional people. They could afford to get a little boat across to this little island. And there was lots of little children as well, they were in a bad state, and we used to feed them and bring them up to Miami. And so kind of history repeating itself a little bit, I think. Don't you?
All right, Louis, thank you very much. Interesting little historical note there. Michael, last call on this. Michael.
How you doing? Listen, I agree with much of what Phil Kelly has said there. And I just want to point out that Fidel and the Cuban people saw Ireland and Cuba as 2 islands in a sea of struggle. And I want to know what is Phil doing in the British Labour Party, which is...
He should be in the Revolutionary Socialist Party, you think?
Very, very much an imperialist party.
I'm not going to put words in Douglas's mouth, but he was probably thinking that too.
William, we have a revolutionary party here, and Fidel supported our struggle, and anybody who wants to get involved in
well,
our
maybe,
struggle
Michael,
should
just maybe we're watching the Castroization of the Labour Party at the minute.
William,
well, I hope so.
Is that possible, Phil?
William, there's many people. There's many people.
You know I'm teasing you.
There's many people in the quote-unquote British Labour Party that would agree with that analysis and say, "What am I doing in their party?" I want to just come back to the point that's come up again from the detractors of the brutality and the oppression of the regime.
Well, Phil,
sorry,
my point?
Something that came up as well about the free market economy.
Yeah, we got to answer his question. What are you doing in the Labour Party with these ideas? If you so strongly believe in the revolutionary principles of Castro, why are you not in the Revolutionary Socialist Party?
I believe, and as one of the Havana declarations declared, that where there's a democratic way to redress your issues, where there's a way forward for a socialist agenda, a progressive agenda through democracy, that is the route to travel. And that's why I see the transformation within the Labour Party as something that is positive and encouraging. And it's a process that's only beginning. But the talk of free market liberal economics as benign is frankly wrong, because if we want to talk about brutality and oppression across the globe, globalization has been a brutal and oppressive force for people across this globe.
We have got to leave it there. I'm so grateful. Douglas, yes, a very brief response, if you would. Yes.
I'm reminded so much when Phil is saying this of the famous story of George Orwell speaking to a communist apologist when the communist apologist says to Orwell, "You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs." And Orwell said, "Where's your omelette?" Phil and others have to present mildly better literacy standards in Cuba and a health service they claim to revere as this wonderful omelette. And the point is, it doesn't excuse the thousands of broken eggs that constituted the murders by firing squad that Castro ordered. It doesn't excuse the hundreds and hundreds of people who were assassinated on Castro's orders internally in Cuba. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't excuse it that an international left that dislikes America can use dead Cubans as their allegedly broken eggs.
Douglas Murray, thank you very much. Thanks also to Phil Kelly. A meeting of minds, shall we say? No.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.